Hey guys, welcome to Crazy Days. Today, let's talk a little bit more about we had everything but money. A lot of these stories we can relate to, and that's why I like this book. This today is talking about a city girl experiencing farm life for the first time. This woman is writing the story about her life after the stock market crashed, and she's talking about she never wanted to marry a farmer. She enjoyed her husband working in the city, but when the stock market crashed, things happened. First, they couldn't afford the payments on their washing machine. And then later, it became the house. They had to do something. They did not want to stand in a soup line because they could not pay the payments on their house. So they agreed to move in with his parents out in the country and become a farmer. She didn't like the idea, but she agreed to do it. And the parents lived in a house, a two-story house, and they lived in the second story with one child. And she said they didn't have any electricity, and they wanted to farm, and they didn't have any money. So the job was close enough to the house that her husband could see the house. And she said one way, he didn't even own a watch, so he didn't know what time it was. So one way she could let him know that it was time to eat so he could come for lunch or whatever was to take a clean white diaper, tie it on a broom handle, and tie it on the front porch. And he could see it from a distance, and he could tell that it was time for him to run home and eat and then go back to work. Because back then, lots of people left their jobs if they lived within walking distance, went home and ate and came back. So while they were at his parents' house, to farm they needed horses, and they didn't have any. So they had no money. And the guy that had the horses agreed to let them have the horses on a note. They had to pay for them month to month, but they didn't have a down payment. And they didn't need their vacuum cleaner anymore because they were without electricity. So he agreed to take the vacuum cleaner as a down payment, and they paid monthly notes on their horses they needed to pull the equipment in order to farm the land with their parents. And so bartering, that's going to be big now. We barter all the time. We're big barters. We love to barter. But that was one way they did things, was barter. And they had to have a note because they couldn't pay for it. They lived in the upstairs part of her in-laws' house for a year. And she fed her family for $1 to $1.25 a week. We can't even do one meal for that, for a family of 4. But she had to feed her whole family for $1.25 a week. So after a year or so, she is going to have a second child, and they decide it's time now that they find their own place. And they find a place to rent that's not too far from the in-laws. And she said it was a shack, and the barn was just in shambles, and a couple of outbuildings that were falling apart. And she just told him, I won't live there. How many of us would not want to live in a shack? Sometimes you got to do what you got to do. But it was close to where they needed. It was available, and they could afford it. And her husband said, look, we'll fix it up. So they move into a house that the wallpaper, she said, the ceiling paper, back then they put wallpaper type stuff on the ceilings. It was hanging down, touching the floor. So the landlord came in and helped them with some of it, but most of it that he didn't fix because he too was in a bind. So they lived in this house in shambles, gradually fixing up as they could. And within a couple of years, they ended up buying this house and the land because the landlord lost it. It went into foreclosure, and they bought it for pennies on the dollar, and they fixed it up, and they lived there. After they had their third child, they decided they wanted a cow. And so this is like probably getting close to 1935, 36, somewhere along in there. And so they didn't have the money for the cow. They had to make a note to pay for the cow, but they did, so that they would have milk and cheese and butter that they needed on their place. Their clothes, they didn't buy clothes. Very, very little clothes. Clothes were passed down from one boy to the next. They had 3 boys. The oldest passed down. That was the way it is. You didn't buy new clothes for everybody, and you patched. If there was a place that needed fixing, you fixed it and wore it again until it was wore out. By 1936, they decided to put a well down, and then a year later, they put a windmill. The ending says, those few years were very trying, but we survived and learned from them, and we're not sorry that we experienced them. And the guy said, we weren't poor, we were just hard up. And that was a phrase that a lot of people used during that time, just hard up. Coming from a city out to a farm life is very different. Lots of things are different. You have to learn a whole new way of life. So it can be done. Sometimes you have to live in something that you wouldn't have thought about in previous life. I never thought I would have to clean out rabbit pens and clean out chicken pens and things like that. I didn't think I would have to butcher animals, and that's just not something I thought I would do. But sometimes to survive, that's what you need to do. You need to learn these skills. So living on a farm has its ups, it has its downs. We weren't poor, just hard up. So we had everything but money, guys. You're going to enjoy this book, and we'll talk a little more. I've got a whole bunch of stories in this book that I love, and so hopefully we'll see if we can't find more of them to talk about. Thank you guys from Crazy Days.